Chapter 3 Telltale Evidence. The visitors finally decided to find out what had happened behind the swinging door, but to do so cautiously. Mr. Drew insisted upon looking first. Carefully, he opened the door and peered inside. "I guess everything's safe," he said, and motioned the others to follow him. Beyond was a large kitchen, and in the center of the floor lay the robot, its head off. "My goodness!" Mrs. Melody exclaimed. Is he dead?" Mr. Drew smiled. "At least he is being beheaded," he answered. "But the rest of his body may be hot." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Carrier asked. The lawyer explained that he did not know exactly how the robot worked. It was possible the figure was charged with electricity and should not be touched. "Let's find out," Nancy suggested, and began pulling out kitchen drawers. Finally, she found what she was looking for. A long-handled wooden spoon. "Perfect," her father said. "This is a non-conductor. We'll soon know if our little friend is hot." He began poking into the neck of the robot and announced, "Here's a tape." Further exploration revealed that many wires and pulleys ran to the robot's arms and legs. "Evidently," Nancy remarked, "this little man was programmed to do certain things, even to warn visitors away." Mrs. Melody looked puzzled. "But if nobody was here, how did it start?" "I'm not sure," Mr. Drew replied. "Some robots are set off by heat, even the warmth of a human body. Others are designed to react to sound. I suspect it is sound in this case." Mrs. Carrier said, "You mean that when we came into the house, the pitch of our voices activated the robot?" "Possibly," Mr. Drew replied. Nancy took a flashlight from her purse and shone it down inside the figure. "A lot of wires are broken," she said, "so we can be doubly sure this creature won't hurt us. But I do think he should be fixed. I have a hunch he's going to figure big in our mystery." She opened other drawers and presently came upon reels of tapes, marked with numbers and letters. Nancy turned to Mrs. Carrier. "Is there a good electrician in town who would come and repair the robot?" she asked. Several seconds went by before the woman replied. "I dislike the thought of bringing strangers here," she said. "But if you really feel that the robot might be a clue to the whereabouts of my brother, I'll agree. There's a very good electrician in Mountainville. I'll get in touch with him." Nancy thanked her and then suggested that they search the house. The kitchen was modern, with an outside door which had a Yale lock. "I hope we don't have any more scares," Mrs. Melody said. On one side of the center hall, in back of a den, was the dining room with crudely made but symmetrical furniture. Its walls contained several paintings, all of queer-looking undersea creatures, some with long tentacles. The living room was on the opposite side of the hall. It was furnished with ultra-modern pieces and had a large convex bookcase on the hall side. As the group mounted the zigzag steps to the second floor, Nancy and Mrs. Melody began to giggle. The woman said, "This is like climbing a stony mountain trail that twists and turns every few feet." The bedrooms and a study proved to be comfortable, but filled with weird and ghoulish silver figurines. In the room where Raleigh apparently slept, the bed had a high peak under the middle of the spread. Mrs. Melody remarked, "Sally, do you suppose your brother slept with his legs draped over that barrier?" "He's tall enough to," Mrs. Carrier answered. Nancy examined the bed and found that it contained a jointed mattress which could be moved electrically. She pushed one of the control buttons and the mattress descended to a flat position. "That looks better," Mrs. Carrier said. While the others gazed at the ultra-modern etchings on the wall, Nancy walked over to a fireplace, which looked as if it had been used frequently. Ashes and half-burned logs lay just inside the hearth. A slender, rounded brass box stood at the edge. Nancy opened it and gasped. Inside were a dozen taper matches that looked like the one she had found on the balcony of the motel. Not wishing to upset Mrs. Carrier, Nancy went over to her father, took his hand, and unobtrusively guided him to the brass box. Then she walked back to the two women. Mr. Drew lifted the lid and gave Nancy a knowing look as he closed it. A few minutes later, Mrs. Carrier and Mrs. Melody left the room and went downstairs. The Drews discussed the clue of the taper match. It certainly seems to indicate that Raleigh set the fires and stole the papers, Mr. Drew stated. To make sure, said Nancy, I'll take one of these fireplace matches along and compare it with the match I have at the motel. When she and her father joined the two women at the foot of the crooked stairway, Mrs. Carrier said she was worried about leaving the property unguarded. There's a lot of valuable artwork and silver pieces in this house. What do you think I should do, Mr. Drew? The lawyer suggested a watchman. They found a telephone and directory in the kitchen and looked up the name of an employment agency in Mountainville. As Mrs. Carrier dialed the number, she gazed at the headless robot and remarked, "That thing gives me the creeps." "Hello, Tepper Employment Agency?" "Yes, Frank Furness speaking." Mrs. Carrier gave the address of Raleigh Banister's house and said she would like to hire a watchman to guard the place day and night. "I'll call you back," Mr. Furness said, "after I contact some names on our list." 20 minutes later, the phone rang. "I'm sorry, madam, but I couldn't find anyone to help you out. You know, that place has a reputation of being a crazy house. The men I asked said they wouldn't go there for $1 million. He hung up. When Mrs. Carrier repeated the conversation, Nancy smiled. "Don't worry. If guards are afraid to come here, I'm sure burglars would be too." "I hope you're right," Mrs. Carrier said with a deep sigh. "I suppose we may as well leave." The front door was securely locked, and the visitors walked to Nancy's car. Mr. Drew slid into the driver's seat. Nancy sat next to him. "On the way back to town," he said, "Mrs. Melody and I must leave directly after lunch." Nancy was disappointed. She had just become involved in the baffling mystery, and now she must give it up. To her surprise, Mr. Drew said, "Nancy, if you are willing to stay here, I'd like you to continue work on the case." The young sleuth's eyes lighted up. "Dad, that's terrific! You know I'll do my best." "Not so fast," her father said, patting Nancy on the shoulder. "There's one big condition that goes with this." "What is it, Dad?" Mr. Drew said he would like Nancy to call her friends Bess and George to see if they could come and stay with her. "If they can't, you'll have to return home with me." Bess Marvin and George Fane were cousins. The two girls had been friends of Nancy's for many years. They often accompanied her when she was working on mysteries and always proved to be of great help. After dropping Mrs. Carrier at her home, the Drews and Mrs. Melody returned to the motel. Nancy immediately phoned George and asked if she and Bess could spend a few days with her in Mountainville to solve a mystery. Nancy mentioned the motel fire. "If you girls can come, please call Hannah and have her pack a suitcase of clothes for me." George said she would do this and let Nancy know the plans. During lunch, she received a call from George saying she and Bess could come. They were getting a ride with a relative who had passed through Mountainville about 5 o'clock. Nancy told her father the good news. He wished the three girls luck and added with a chuckle, "Mrs. Melody, I always give Nancy hard assignments, and always with great confidence that she will come up with the right answers." He smiled affectionately at his daughter. Nancy smiled back, though she did not feel confident about solving this mystery. She had been given the difficult task of learning the whereabouts of a man who had not only disappeared, but had left behind a frightening robot. She drove her father and Mrs. Melody to a bus stop directly after lunch and then went on a shopping tour to look at fall clothes. If she were going to stay in Mountainville for some time, there might be cool days. For a while, Nancy's mind was taken completely off the mystery as she tried on sports suits. She decided to purchase a tan suit, then bought shoes to match. Later, Nancy stopped at the police station and the firehouse to inquire if there was any new information on Raleigh Banister or the person who had set the three blazes at the motel. In each case, the answer was no. Leaving the firehouse, Nancy looked at her wristwatch. She still had plenty of time before Bess and George would arrive, and decided to walk back leisurely to the motel. As she gazed into an art shop window, a man's voice behind her said, "Hello, Nancy Drew." She turned to face a stranger. Nancy was sure she had never seen him before. "I guess you don't remember me," said the tall, thin man with a rather pinched face. He was in his 30s, Nancy judged, and the thought also ran through her mind that he could use a good meal. He laughed and said, "I met you at Emerson College, where I used to teach. I'm Clyde Mead." Still, Nancy could not remember him. Emerson was the school her friend Ned Nickerson attended, and she had been to many football games and house parties there. She tried her best to recall this man, but failed. "You're not at the college now?" Nancy asked. "No." "What do you do?" "I'm a professional fundraiser. At present, I'm working on an appeal you'll certainly be interested in." The longer the man talked, the more suspicious Nancy became of his former connection with Emerson College and of his sincerity. She decided to get away from him as quickly as possible. End of chapter 3.